So glad you could be with us here on the Joni and Friends Ministry podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Keating. Walking a mile in someone's shoes is a great way to understand their personal struggles and perspectives. And while my guests today don't put that much wear and tear on their actual shoes, they're both wheelchair users, we can certainly gain a lot of perspective from their own personal experiences of living and working in a wheelchair. We're picking up the conversation we began last week with Scott Bankhead and Tracey Motoda. You can find part 1 of that conversation and all of the Joni and Friends ministry podcasts on joniandfriends.org/podcast or on Apple Music, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. There's a new podcast every week, so don't miss anything. Subscribe today and stay with us. Tracey and Scott are reflecting on some of the challenges they face because of their disability. And it's not just battling staircases. We're learning how to break down those visible and invisible barriers that may be keeping you from fully experiencing friendship with people impacted by disability, right here on the Joni and Friends Ministry podcast. Let's talk a little bit about disability in public, and we touched on it somewhat, but what are some of the challenges that you've faced, like in the grocery store, getting gas? I know, Scott, you have a good story, a good and a funny story, or being at a restaurant, even in a doctor's office.
Yeah, I was reflecting on some of the things that have happened, and I think, like Scott, being a wheelchair user or someone with a physical disability, we have to extend a lot of grace, and I know God calls us to be humble, and these are opportunities to practice that. And when I was more independent and I was driving, I would sometimes do our weekly grocery shopping by myself, and it was pretty interesting sight. I had the plan of attack. I would stack my lap very strategically with my groceries. And sometimes I would have to ask someone to reach something off a high shelf for me. And it was always interesting. Sometimes people either overestimate or underestimate my abilities and may try to hand me something that's heavy, but I can only lift about 1 pound.
Right.
So things end up on the floor when that happens. But that's when you can just laugh and say, oh, sorry, I should have told you I can't lift that. Things like that. It's just an opportunity to share and experience life with strangers in a new way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think there is a sense where you have learned to be comfortable with letting them know what you can and can't do.
Absolutely. I've never been afraid to ask for help. And
you always do it with a big smile. That goes a long way.
Well, I want people to know how thankful and grateful I am for their willingness to help me. I know that sometimes people have busy lives, and you may be in a hurry in the grocery store. You may be thinking about some troubles that you're experiencing or what you have to do next. And yet, here I am. Excuse me, ma'am, or excuse me, sir, could you reach something for me, please? And I want to make sure that I stay humble and kind and show my gratitude in that.
Sure, and I'm sure most people would love to help you. Scott, what about you? You've had some onlookers.
I've certainly had many onlookers. I have a little crane that goes out and puts my wheelchair into the bed of my pickup, and so anytime that operates, it draws a crowd. It just does, and most of the time when it draws a crowd is at a gas station because I have to get out to get gas, and so anytime that I do that, it draws an audience and people start examining it. And I know that a few months ago when there was a rocket launch here in Southern California, people were stopping in the middle of the road to watch it. And I get that sort of feel at the gas station every time that I'm there because people stop and watch. But at the same time, it's a great thing for me to be able to interact with people in a way that I wouldn't otherwise get to interact with them and be able to get to talk to them and just talk about things, and it provides open doors that I wouldn't otherwise normally have. I will say that being and just going and doing normal everyday things provides me the opportunity to practice humility as Tracey was talking about. And I know one of those things is just like the independent, prideful part of me is just like I want to be able to do all of these things by myself at all times, sort of thing. And I'll say I've learned that at the grocery store as well, trying to get a 2-liter bottle of root beer off the top shelf, and if you don't catch it on the way down and it hits capside down, it creates a rocket in the grocery store. So yeah, that'll happen as well. And
Speaking of rocket launches,
yeah,
right?
speaking of rocket launches, root beer rocket launches.
Oh dear.
But sometimes it just really does give the opportunity to practice humility and to engage people in conversations you wouldn't other have, and that's a privilege.
Mm-hmm. What about challenges in the workplace, Tracey? You've worked here for a year and a half, 2 years, almost, and this is an environment at Joni and Friends where people are very familiar with disability for the most part. I don't want to make assumptions, but we're generally all comfortable, or we're learning to be comfortable. But that wasn't always the case for you. How did you manage some of those challenges that you faced in the workplace with coworkers, especially?
I think I've had a few powerful experiences in the workplace. One of my first jobs out of college was at the Oregon Youth Authority. And they were located in a small old house, actually, and there was no ramp. And they built me a ramp because they wanted to hire me. And what a blessing that was. That they were like,
they stepped up.
Yeah, they saw potential in me, and they wanted to make it happen. I've also experienced, I had an HR person when I applied for a job tell me that I would be expected to do just as much work as if I wasn't disabled, which absolutely I'm going to do my work and more. Exactly. So I think there's been perceptions, but I've been given the opportunity to, I would say, shatter those perceptions, to go above and beyond and show what it means to incorporate people with disabilities into the workplace. Sometimes, yes, it takes accommodations, building a physical ramp, maybe putting the files on a lower shelf. But the reward and the gain is well worth the work that goes into the beginning.
That's great. And I feel that way about you. I had one of those emoji moments when I met you with the emoji with the heart eyes, because we were looking for an admin, and you came on the first day to volunteer, and you came whirring around the corner in your pink wheelchair, and it was just that feeling. I mean, I look back and think that's a God thing, but it was, this is our person. This is the missing puzzle to our team. And, the rest has been history, but you're so productive. You talk to so many people on the phone. Your experiences have really given you the insight, not just personally, but working in youth authority, working with families who have really struggled. And we're happy to make any accommodations for you, but you're the one that helps us the most. So I'm just so grateful. Let's transition a little bit to the church. Let's talk about disability within the church. Same question as before. What's been challenging? What's been helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my perspective, and I know that this applies to Tracey to at least some extent as well, that primarily because we have orthopedic disabilities, that is the obstacle of us being involved in the church is a physical one. So if we can attain access to the building or to the activity that we're doing, that's the extent of the accommodation that we need. And so it's been amazing to me to see churches, even my own little small church and small school growing up, just people willing to step up and do something that may seem small, like, glue a couple of 2x4s together and make it a makeshift ramp sort of thing. And so, but it's just amazing to me to see that people are willing to take whatever steps that they can to accommodate you in that way. And to me, that indicates to people that aren't just disabled, but people that are lost, lonely, broken, hurting, whatever, that is a church that is willing to take steps to include them. And it is a hard and difficult thing for a church to teach truth and love well at the same time.
Yes.
But that is such a worthy pursuit. And it's amazing to see churches do that well.
I think you nailed it. That's the Irresistible Church.
Absolutely.
When onlookers can say, okay, I see them welcoming and including, and not just including, but people with disabilities are part of the church. They're part of the family they're serving. If they're included, then me with my insecurities, maybe my addictions, if that's the Jesus that says, I love you, if they're being included, then I'm welcome here too. And I think that's a powerful picture of something so external that's really going on inside of a lot of us who feel like, am I going to be welcomed even though I feel so different when I walk through the doors of this church? It's a powerful picture. Right. Tracey, what about you?
I think that Scott and I probably sound like a broken record, but it's it's true. It's that seeing a need and filling the hole, filling the gap, and making it happen for people. When I was growing up, we went to a small Lutheran church, and it didn't have a ramp. And the Sunday school was downstairs. My dad would sometimes carry me downstairs until I got too big, and then my church built a ramp. When I did communion, they built a ramp so I could get up there. And so I think
they eliminated the barriers,
and we didn't have to ask. I think that was powerful as well. I think the need was visualized, and the church came around it and made it happen. And it really was, for me, it was just church members coming together and building this ramp. And I think that is what's been most powerful to me, is when a need is seen, it's confirmed, because they would obviously need to make sure that was truly a need.
Right, they're asking you about it with the intent of, we're doing this.
We're fixing it for you.
Tell us how.
Right. I think that's powerful. It's a wonderful example of how the body of Christ can support each other.
I totally agree. Well, thinking about Joni and her life in a wheelchair, cancer, chronic pain, she shared through the years that people have often come up to her, people even write, saying, Joni, we are praying for you with full faith. We're praying for your physical healing. And I know that is something that she always welcomes. She never turns down. And Nick Vujicic, too, we heard him a few weeks ago, no arms and no legs, saying that that's not even something that he prays for anymore. He is so content in his life. And I know this is really personal, but for both of you, is praying for healing something you even think about or pray about?
I think for me, as I said, I've been in a wheelchair since I was 5, and I don't have any memory of praying for my physical healing to get up and out of this wheelchair.
Never.
Not that I remember. In fact, I was just having a conversation with my mom last night, and she was sharing that she remembers me asking questions about, will I walk in heaven? Will I be able to roller skate in heaven? That's that's pretty cute. I don't remember that one. But so I think for myself, that comes from a deep contentment in my knowledge that God ordained this body for me. That I remember my parents, the message I always received was, God does not make mistakes. There's a purpose for this. Go out and find it. And I feel like God has helped me find the purpose in my disability. It's to help others who are facing disability and struggles, and to show that you can have immense joy even in the face of a life where your arms don't work much and your legs don't work at all. That's why I think I don't personally pray for my physical healing.
And you live that out so well. Every day you come in with a joyful spirit. You're ready to pray. You're ready to pray on behalf of other people. And I can just see how God has used you immensely here as you respond to people who are writing saying, I'm discouraged. I remember even you were answering the letter of a little girl. Maybe her dad wrote. Dad wrote she had SMA like you.
Same disease I do. She was praying for her healing, I believe. She didn't have a sense of contentment yet.
Right. She was young,
very
5 or
young.
6?
I think she was 5 or 6, and she had a lot of questions about, why did God make me this way?
That's right.
So I think it was such a gift that God placed me in this place, this exact moment in time,
right,
to be able to speak into her family and just share my story. And through God and what He's done in my life, I just pray that they found hope.
Absolutely.
In hearing from me.
And she was thrilled to hear from you, and I think so is Dad.
Yeah, I hope so.
So that was a gift. Scott, what about you when it comes to praying for healing?
Yeah, I honestly, I would say for me, that has looked differently in different periods of my life. Because I can remember a time when I prayed for my healing, but that was mostly centered around like junior high-ish sort of age when being a junior high boy that's in a wheelchair is a difficult thing because at that point in time, especially when you're in a small school and everyone does everything extracurricularly and is kind of expected to participate in
For
every
sure.
sport if they're even remotely able to do so. The fact that that was sort of the athletic culture that I was in, and everyone we were
Football
good.
is big
and
in
football
Texas, as you
football is
said.
king in Texas, and so growing up in that culture, it was a difficult thing to be a junior high boy and have hormones kicking in and all sorts of things that were telling me that I should be different
Right.
physically
Yeah.
than I was. But then, again, I had wonderful parents who were able and willing to encourage me to step into the things that I was good at. And so I received tremendous encouragement in being able to step into my own giftings. And that was a tremendous privilege. But then also, just as I got older and I grew in my relationship with the Lord, especially in my college years, it was like, yeah, it would be nice to have those things. But man, I really only want it if that is something that the Lord is going to use powerfully for his name. And I was in an academic environment or in a college and spiritual environment that was kind of ripe for that. And so it was one of those things where it's like, yeah, it would be great to have it, but man, only do it if you're going to do something really amazing with it. And really kind of just, even now, that's kind of transitioned into, God, do whatever you want with my life if you're going to do something amazing with it. And it's like, I don't know if that means wheelchair for the rest of my life or if it means walking or whatever. Like, I'm open to whatever the answer to that might be. It's like, if you're going to put it in there, I trust that you're going to use it. And so that's really my prayer at this point is just, Lord, use whatever you're going to put before me for your glory.
What a trust in him and his goodness and his plan. And similarly to Tracey, Scott, your work here in the response department is largely impacted by your walk with God and the way that he's growing you and you're trusting him. And I think that comes across strongly. You have a platform to really write and speak into people who say, I am discouraged. I am still praying for my healing. And I so appreciate the way that God has brought our team together, all the puzzle pieces fitting together to glorify his name. As we think about your many experiences, there are things that people could have done differently that maybe would have been more helpful. How would you encourage those of us who honestly feel uncomfortable or maybe at a loss of words when we're around somebody with a disability? They're thinking, do I talk about their disability? Do I not? Is that the first question I ask? Do I avoid it altogether? What do I do with these feelings? I want to help, and I kind of want to look away at the same time. I mean, there is a level of discomfort in people, and I think we should talk about it. What's been really helpful to you, and what advice would you give?
Yeah, I think for me, it's just the realization that unfamiliar is always uncomfortable.
Yes, it is.
And so for me, I didn't grow up around anyone at all that had any sort of intellectual or developmental delays. That was just not part of my experience. And it wasn't part of my experience until the last few years when I've become involved with Joni and Friends. And so the first time that I got into that environment, I was also very uncomfortable. I'm disabled, but still, being in that sphere was uncomfortable for me because it was just new. But then it got to the point where it's like I got to be, just through exposure and having experienced relationships and friendships with those people, that I could realize that they're just people. They have interests, desires, the need for relationship that I do. And so I can treat them just as a person, and so it's really not difficult in that respect. That yes, of course you learn mannerisms and behaviors that are more or less appropriate in any given context, but that's just relationships.
Right.
And so it was tremendously helpful for me to just expose myself to those situations where I was just going to become more familiar and more comfortable in those just because I was exposed to it. And so I think from that perspective, it is just tremendously helpful. But at the same time, I think as far as answering your question about do I approach that topic or the thing that might seem uncomfortable or whatever, do I approach that in conversation? And just like every relationship, whether it be a disability or there was a death in the family or there's some obvious insecurity that that person has, I think you have to gauge that just based on your relationship and your interactions with that person.
Right.
It's kind of like
Don't come in guns blazing
don't
like
come
you
in
know it all.
guns blazing, and just gauge it on how you feel that relationship is going, because oftentimes that person is going to open up and talk to you about those things.
Right.
But if they don't, give them space. But at a certain point, it's almost like the person has a pink pet elephant that's with them at all times, but you, for 6 years, refuse to acknowledge it.
Right.
And it's like,
Yeah.
it's obvious to both of us that this is in the room.
Right.
And at some point, your ignorance or your willful detachment from that topic almost creates a taboo, even for the person that is disabled. It's like, well, if the able-bodied person doesn't want to talk about it and seems to want to talk about it for 6 years, obviously they don't want to and they're uncomfortable with it. So why should I approach the topic either?
Right.
So at some point, disengaging from those topics does communicate a lack of desire for a relationship, which is not good either. So again, just gauge it on your relationship, and at some point, it really does become appropriate to broach those topics. It really does, because that's just a part of getting to know one another.
Yes. And that's good. And I've heard both of you kind of talk about, hey, if you want to know stuff, ask me to lunch. And maybe you could phrase or preface the questions, hey, I'm not sure if this is too personal, but I was wondering about X, Y, and Z. And then you have the opportunity to say, gosh, I'd love to tell you about that. Or, yeah, I don't know how you'd handle those more private questions, but I think for those who are learning and want to be respectful, the disability etiquette, quote unquote, I think you just go there respectfully, just about anything. And what a great picture of saying there's those who are facing grief, there's those who are facing other hardships, and how do you approach those? It's similarly with respect and care and kindness. Tracey, what would you say to that same question? Give us some good advice.
A lot of you know my nickname.
TMI Tracey.
Yeah, I'm a bit of an oversharer. So I think for me, it makes me uncomfortable when people don't ask me about my disability.
Right. It's like, let's get it out
Let's
here.
talk about it. It's my life. It's so intermingled with every aspect of my life that if you're not curious, you might not be curious about other things I do in life. So I feel like giving the person with the disability the option to share their story, to share their life with you is the most powerful thing you can do. Just greet them. I'm an extrovert, so it doesn't take too much for me to be the first to make conversation. So hopefully that helps in those interactions. But if you come upon someone that you would like to just chat with, that you want to talk with, who may have a disability, I couldn't tell you enough how much it means to just be approached as an individual with kindness. Smile at me, I'll smile back and greet you. I think that's a really
right. Start with hello. We have a booklet called that.
Imagine, that's helpful. I think it is exactly. It sounds elementary, but it's true. Every individual human wants to be acknowledged.
Right.
And part of my individualism is my pink and black wheelchair, right? So I think that's a conversation starter for me, and I'm okay with that. Whereas some people may not be. So
that's true.
Giving that time to understand how a person communicates, how they're comfortable communicating, that's all you can do. We can't give a one-size-fits-all answer to that.
That's a great way to end it. There is no one-size-fits-all. No matter the ability, everybody wants to be known as an individual. And we all have common human tendencies and desires. And so we can just start by getting to know the person. And I am so glad that you guys could spend the time doing this. I just love your openness and honesty. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us on the Joni and Friends Ministry podcast, you guys. So grateful for you.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for having
much.
us.
Being known and loved by God is the highest purpose of anyone's life. And when you reach out and love to those in your community with a disability, you are reflecting the heart of Christ. Here at Joni and Friends, it's our mission to share the hope of the gospel and equip Christ-honoring churches to love and disciple people impacted by disability. Because while our needs may differ, Christ's love is the same for each one of us. To learn more about how you can create an inclusive ministry environment in your church or community, visit joniandfriends.org/podcast and find our free resources. And while you're there, drop us a note. I'd love to hear how this podcast has made an impact on you or even answer your questions. I mean it when I say that this podcast gives real answers to real questions. So if there's something you've been wondering about, or an issue you've encountered, or maybe a topic you'd like to hear addressed on the podcast, let us know. Next week's special Valentine's Day conversation is with Jamie and Kevin Stark. And while they've been married for 3 years, Kevin has been a quadriplegic for 8. Like any marriage, it's been filled with its joys and trials, its ups and downs. But through it all, this amazing couple has gained a unique perspective on the emotions, challenges, and rewards of navigating a post-injury lifestyle. I'm your host, Crystal Keating, inviting you to join us again next week for that conversation, right here on the Joni and Friends Ministry podcast.